Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jim Hodgson and Garry Goff. We're here at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home of the most touchable warbirds in Texas. Today's episode goes right in line with the weather. We're going to talk about cold weather operations. That's one of those terms that would normally create fear in the hearts of professional pilots.
No.
Got a message here. It says, share this with. Yeah, we'll share. Okay. So there we go. Okay, sorry. So other than saying that your airplane is on fire,
this is the second worst.
This is the second. But even if you're on fire, it's you can sometimes control that. But with cold weather operations, you are going into conditions that you may be in for a long time, and you have to prepare to go in, and you have to prepare depending on whether it's going to be on the other end of your flight. So we're going to talk pretty much about commercial aviation here today, because that's the biggest part of our experience. And we're going to talk about a little bit of the technicalities of it first. And then as we've been sitting here waiting, we've been exchanging stories of cold weather operations. And we'll do that a little bit later.
Things that you don't want to do.
Yeah, things that you don't want to do. But cold weather operations are based on certain meteorological conditions that are going to be present. Of course, there's a time of year. And tell you, well, it's in the fall, and with Continental, and I'm sure with American, there was always a refresher training session that took place, whether it was a CBT or whether it was a classroom session or part of a recurrent or something like that. There was always something that you did as a refresher, because it's not something you do every day. So the biggest issue was recognizing the conditions. And it always surprised me that cold weather operations started at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But then the possibility, it's always the possibility of getting into the situation. So it was always a matter of ice, rain, visible moisture, those kinds of things.
And every time you went to the simulator,
it
was at night, and it was in icing conditions.
Yeah, always.
Always.
But what we're talking about here with cold weather operations and de-icing and those kinds of things are what's referred to as the clean airplane concept.
Yes.
Which means you don't want any contamination on the airplane.
Because sometimes it depends on what type of ice you're in. Literally, ice can build up on your wing. Here's the rest of your wing here, literally looking like a C. So as you can imagine, that's not a way to make the airflow go over the wing to give you proper lift. There's other things that it can do. It can actually deform your wing, so it's like you got a big hump on it, so the air goes up over like that, and you're not flying. The wing doesn't fly like that.
No.
And those are the weird things that can happen when you enter icing conditions.
Well, and there's different types of ice too. There's glare ice and rime ice, and so you had to be able to determine what kind you had or whether you were in the conditions. Now, we always flew with the pitot-static systems on.
Always heated.
Always heated. Regardless of the time of year. But that was one of the primary things, because of the pitot-static system. You've got a ram air port on the airplane, and then you've got static ports. And the airplane is taking those pressure differentials and determining what your airspeed is and what your altitude is. But if the pito's clogged,
every time you went to the simulator, I think every single time I went to the simulator, you would always have one episode, whether myself or the first officer, that the pitot-static system would ice over, and it was really strange, because as you're starting to fly the airplane and starting to climb out, the airspeed indicator just starts really increasing, because it becomes an altimeter.
Right.
And of course it's climbing because you're climbing, and so the whatever the habit or whatever it is that we want to bring the throttles back, because you can't go faster than 250 knots below 10,000 feet.
Right.
So you're wanting to bring the throttles back, but that is not a good idea, because that's not what's happening. And so to recognize it, to look across the cockpit and go, wait a minute, that one's right, mine's wrong. And it's real distracting the first time it happens to you.
Yeah, it's what's referred to as reverse sensing, and there have been plenty of accidents that have occurred about this kind of thing. But in an airliner, you've got multiple pitot-static systems. Now we've got this A7 here to kind of demonstrate a few things. And frankly, I don't know how many pitot-static systems were on the A7, but I'm going to assume it was probably one, maybe two. but there were certain places on the airplane that are prone to collecting ice. And of course, one of it's going to be the nose or the inlets, the inlet cowling. And of course, you've got the leading edge of the wings. And then of course on the tail too. Those are places where ice is going to collect when you're airborne. Now you can get some of that on the ground, but I think if we took the sequence of flight, you'd show up in the morning, you'd find out you had the conditions existed for icing. Or you'd walk into ops and there'd be a sign up that'd say cold weather operations are in effect, called Snowflake. Everybody had a different
we had
name.
Snowman. That's what our guy was. I forgot about that.
Snowman.
Yeah.
And get your lineup for being de-iced or anti-iced depending on the conditions, because you've got two situations. You've got one where the conditions exist and there may be ice on the airplane, so you're going to get it de-iced, which means hot water and glycol. And that's a single stage icing where they kind of, it was light, it may be frost or a little bit of snow.
And it was really big, like he said up here in the intake, it was really big for us that when we went out to the jet to make sure there was no ice on the intake, because if you start up the engine and put on the heating element, that stuff's going to come down your motor and it's going to damage fan blades.
Yeah.
So this is real important, what Jim is saying.
And we look at the compressor blades too, because you may already have it. You don't necessarily know what the situation has been with the airplane. It may have just come in and that's fine. But then you have other things like a cold soaked airplane.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that with the MD-80 here in a minute.
Oh yeah.
So you had to plan for these different contingencies. You had to do the walk around. You had to determine what you needed. You'd get back in the airplane and you'd say, we only need de-icing.
Because if it's clear outside, there's no precip coming down. All you're going to need is de-ice. The worst thing is if you not only do you need to be de-iced because there's stuff all over your airplane, but it's snowing. And so now you've got a problem. Or freezing rain. Oh God, freezing rain was horrible.
That was the worst.
Oh man, awful. So that's what determined whether you did the one step, which Jim said, whether it's the water and glycol, just to get rid of it, or the second step, which is to anti-ice the aircraft to keep it from freezing over again.
Yeah, and that's a mixture of glycol and some other things, but it kind of foams up a little bit, or gels up, I guess.
Gel. Yeah, we had gel. Yeah.
And so that gets on the airplane. But then you had a situation with that where you were in line. This becomes a real choreographed event.
Very much so.
After it was done, after the procedure was done, and you had to do things in the airplanes like turn off the APU and that kind of stuff, so you didn't suck the stuff into the airplane.
That would be bad.
But you would have to make contact with the de-icing people, and they would tell you whether they used type 1, 2, 3, or 4 de-icing fluid, what time it went on, what your holdover time was. Because sometimes when you de-ice, depending on the conditions, you only had 30 minutes and then you had to go back in and do it again.
5 minutes. We got to get this thing airborne in 5 minutes, which is difficult to do.
Yeah, depending. I had a couple of situations where we would get out to the runway and the traffic would be out there and there were delays in the departures, and we'd have to turn around and go back to the de-icing deals. Now, when you take off, depending on the conditions on the ground, if it's dry and clear on the ground, that becomes relatively easy.
Yeah.
But I operated out of Newark and Denver, and sometimes you're operating out of places that had contaminated runways to begin with. So you wanted to make sure you're keeping the airplane as clean as you possibly can. So you would taxi out with the flaps up. You would get out on the runway before you put the flaps down. You'd run up the airplane, and of course, even in the beginning, didn't even mention this. You'd take extra time to warm up the engine and get good oil flow. I'm going to have a little hard time reading the questions here, so let me take a quick look.
And what he meant is that if you knew that you were going to start out with a cold-soaked airplane, and there was you're going to start the aircraft up, you've got to let the engines run at idle to be able to generate enough heat within the engine, not to compressor stall or to over torque something. So you had to just sit there for 5 minutes, typically, waiting for enough oil pressure and an oil temperature before you could go taxi the jet.
I said flight appearance could definitely clean up the de-ice for you. Sometimes, but then again, depending on the condition when you took off, you'd let the landing gear hang for a little while to blow off any snow or that kind of stuff, and then you'd suck it all up and be on your way. But you're still penetrating through ice.
Yes.
Ice and snow, and so you had issues with what if you had to return to the airport. and those kinds of things. So then you'd be off on your merry way, and you looked forward to, with a great deal of relief, when you popped out and there was the sun.
Yes.
And you could see what was on the airplane. Now, sometimes before you even took off, you'd have to have a first officer or another crew member or even a flight attendant go back and check the wings one more time before you went, to see if you'd gotten any accumulation on the wings. So this is a very, very involved, very detailed process. Now, there were a number of different ways to be able to de-ice in flight, too, and we'll talk about that a little bit.
We had everybody, all aircraft that I can think of, you're going to have easily the engine anti-ice. You're going to engine heat. You're going to have the engines stay warm, because you don't want anything to come in. The cowls are always heated up. Like I said, the engine cowl, you always want that. But like for me flying the MD-80, there was a big deal whenever you're penetrating icing conditions, because the wings would start to ice up. So we had in our slats out here, we had pneumatic air from one of the stages of the engine, and remember the engine sat back here on the tail, two of them like this, and it would run, the ducting would run up in there, and I think it was every 10 minutes.
Every 10 minutes.
I think that's what it is. You'd hit the wing heat button, and it would divert the heat from the engines, the pneumatic heating air, and it would project it out onto the wings and the tail, which is real critical. And also remember, we had a high tail up here, so it would all keep de-icing that, or anti-icing, I should say, the tail and the wings, and we do that all the time when you're in icing conditions. So you're always hitting the tail de-ice button all the time, and then it would last for 2.5 minutes, and then it would revert back to the engines.
And that was one of the things, you had to be
It's really hot.
Yeah, you had to be pretty proactive with this. Let's see, what do we got here? How about props planes? Yeah, we'll talk about that some
props. Dead.
All of these things, you could start to see the ice on it. With prop planes and helicopters, it's different, because they start to ice up, and they can start to shed the ice just from the centrifugal.
That's not good.
That's one way to find out about it. But some of in the early airplanes, they had bladders on the leading edge of the wings and the tail. Boots. And you'd pump air into those things, and they would flex, and they would break the ice off of the airplane. Now, that's old style, but there were ways to be able to heat the props and that kind of thing. Piston airplanes get the same kind of problems, but normally you're going to do a bigger run-up to make sure your oil temperatures and everything are functioning properly before you go. Now, Garry mentioned the bleed air system. We had it on the 727. In fact, it could be considered dangerous, because we had an emergency procedure in the event that we had a hot air leak in the leading edge of the wing, because then it's going to be burning through the wing.
Not good.
The other place you're diverting hot air is to the cowl lip. Here's the inlet, but on the engine, if you've got an engine, heating the cowl lip so that the icing stays away from the engine, so that it doesn't ingest the ice that way. 787 is different. Although on the triple, like Garry said, you had all of these leading edges in the tail and the cowl lip. On the 787, the only bleed air off of the engine was for the engine cowl lips for de-icing. The leading edges and everything else were completely electric. So your situation now is, maybe you came out of a place that was fine, but you're now going into icing conditions as you're landing, or you may have taken off out of icing and you're going back in. So now you've got other things you need to consider on your descent while you're at idle descent coming down.
Oh, see, we could not go to idle on descent on the MD-80. We had to keep the power up, because we had to be able to keep diverting from the engines to the wings. And so you had to keep it up, gosh, I think it was like 15% or something like that, more than idle. And so you had to really pre-plan your descent, because you're going much faster, and you're going to accelerate down. How am I going to hit the speed limits as we descend down? So it was you really had to back everything off to be able to start your descent, just to be able to deal with all of this extra power on an airplane that's wanting to accelerate where you're wanting to slow down. So we'd have to put the speed brakes out just to help control the speed of the aircraft coming in. And man, when you start getting lower and lower and lower, and snow starts happening and icing and all that stuff, and now you've got to deal with the runway. You're busy up there.
Yeah, you're busy, and it's really it can get really intense. And Garry talked about the runway. This is contaminated runway stuff. You may have left from a contaminated runway. Now you're going to land on a contaminated runway. And that becomes a different situation because you had different grades of the braking conditions that you're coming in. And we were talking about it earlier. If braking conditions were considered nil, you couldn't go. You couldn't land.
No. Nil means none. There is no braking.
None. That
Zero.
means you're landing on ice.
Yeah.
And in many conditions, you'd land on a runway, and the landing spot that everybody had been landing in is pretty dry and pretty ice-free. But then as you're slowing down and you're trying to stop the airplane, you're going further down the runway where fewer and fewer people have been, and you start to get into ice and snow and things like that. And you may be used to with a jetliner of doing a high-speed taxi off of the runway. In this case, you came to a complete stop, and then you just kind of inched yourself around. Let's see I missed that one. Sorry, we'll pick some of these up later on online on the questions.
And what Jim was saying is that as aviation technology advanced, so did the runway technology, and so they began to give us data on what the approach landing zone was like, what midfield was like, and then what the departure end of the field was like, so that it helped us in our decision-making process on what to expect once we landed, because that's the big thing. I remember Denver for a huge, big deal on what to expect, because when you have that kind of information, it allows you to proper plan your arrival onto the runway, which is real critical, because you're just a high-speed tricycle running down the runway, and we need to have bare concrete to be able to slow this tricycle down.
Yeah, and you had to sometimes get on the brakes harder so that you didn't get into the end of the runway. You could land in the beginning and towards the middle, but towards the end it got really bad. The other thing was, once you landed and you taxied clear the runway, you did not pick the flaps up.
No, inspections.
Yeah,
you need to look at that.
You left the flaps down so that when you got back in, somebody could go out and inspect for contamination, ice and snow contamination. And there's another kind of contamination too. We talked about the anti-icing fluid that was put on the airplanes. That creates a gel, and eventually it kind of dries, and it can get into
everything,
the mechanisms on the airplane. So that was one of the things that they were looking for also, that might have to be cleared. So that's a little bit on the different types of procedures and when it would happen, but we were talking about a few stories.
Did you have auto brakes?
Yes, we had auto brakes.
Okay. The MD-80 has auto brakes. Minimum, which didn't do anything. Medium, which did something. And then max, which means you're going to stop. And I'm coming into Montrose, 201, snow. They said the runway's covered in snow. And takeoff is a big deal, how much snow's on there.
Yes, absolutely.
And landing is obviously a big deal because you want to hit the concrete. That's important. So we're coming in, and I've selected max braking because Montrose has got a short runway.
It's a short runway.
Where you go to Purgatory Ski Range. And I remember breaking out, it's 201, and I mean, it's like crystal clear underneath. And I'm looking at the runway, and it looks completely black. And I'm thinking, dude, there's no snow on the runway. Boom, it's time to hit. And I had max brake selected. I'm telling you, we all kissed the windshield, stopped like this, and the only thing I could think of is tell everybody, welcome to the USS Carrier Montrose, because the max brakes works on bare concrete.
They work a lot. They work a lot.
On a snow runway, which I did into, I think it was National.
Right.
Yeah. That's a short runway. And we landed on there, and it sure worked really nice to help slow me down in all that snow.
You know, a lot of accidents have been caused by this kind of thing. The most famous one is probably the what was it, Air Florida?
Yeah.
That crashed into the river at National, and that changed some of the de-icing procedures.
Everything. Yes.
Got a question here. In the ERJ 75, we had rejected 1 through 4 and max auto braking. Thanks, Jim.
Right. Yep.
And that's for we had some similar.
Yeah, because we took off with takeoff brakes.
Yep. But we were talking a little bit about the different conditions. You had You couldn't take off, for instance, if you had more than a ½ inch of slush or water on the runway.
Because the drag, it's going to slow you down as you're trying to accelerate to get airborne.
Or 4 inches of snow. And I went into, with
You
a
guys are
727, we went into Las Vegas.
No.
We went into Las Vegas one time, and it was one of these rare deals where it had snowed in Las Vegas.
No.
And so it was cold weather ops, but the people in Vegas were a little bit sketchy on the cold weather ops. And so, at any rate, when it came time to leave and take off, the tower didn't know what the depth of the snow was on the runway. They hadn't sent anybody out. So it was a 727. So I sent I sent my second officer out the tail to go measure the snow.
How
and of
cruel.
course, if it was if it's 4 inches, we're not leaving. And he comes back and he goes, 3.5 inches, sir. And so we locked it up and departed.
Dude. No, I ain't going to do that.
One of the other things we were talking about earlier was St. Elmo's fire.
Oh, my gosh, St. Elmo's fire. That's cool stuff.
Yeah, it really
until
is.
It
if
goes
you're
off.
not familiar with it, depending on certain atmospheric conditions, things glow. And in the old times on the ships, the masts, they considered it omens. And it was referred to as St. Elmo's fire. Well, we used to get it on the airplane a lot.
Yeah, you'd get the twinkling like this of electricity across the windshield.
Yeah, it
looks pretty cool.
Looks like little lightning across the windshield.
It's really cool looking.
But it always happened in cold conditions when you were around thunderstorms and there was a lot of electrical activity. So it happened during
all sorts of conditions.
Yeah, all sorts of conditions.
Winter, summer, everywhere.
You could expect it most during cold weather operations. It came in a lot of forms. It would start to build up and become different. And with some of the airplanes, it would build up on pointy things like the nose of the airplane.
Yes.
And I know I'd seen that several times. And one time we were flying. I don't remember where it was, but we saw this buildup, this spike come off the nose of the airplane.
That's not
and
good.
we could see the light starting to build up and build up and build up. And I had heard stories about it discharging and sounding like a cannon or a shotgun going off in the airplane. And this thing built up, and I got to tell you, both the first officer and I are kind of cringing because this thing is
lowering down in the seat. This is not going to be good.
Well, it did go off, and a fireball came into the airplane, went underneath the cockpit door, went down the aisle, and went out the back of the airplane, which was a rare occurrence, but it had happened before. But it got everybody's attention on the airplane. That was for sure.
I bet the passengers thought that was cool.
With the ones who saw it.
Yeah, the ones who saw it.
So.
What did your flight attendants think?
Well, they wanted to know what the hell was going on.
I bet they would want to get off the jet. I mean, thinking, what are you doing up there, Captain?
Yeah. So, but cold weather operations are one of the times where you were never cavalier.
No.
You know, people talk about getting real comfortable with an airplane and around the boat, and they get pretty cavalier in the operations.
Not in cold
This
weather.
was one of those times when everything got serious, and nobody was second guessing anything. Mentioned somebody telling you your airplane's on fire. You had a procedure for putting the fire out, and it was a short duration thing.
Yep.
Or you had another engine, you had stuff to be able to extinguish the fire on the airplane, and of course, military jet. The famous call was, "You're on fire, get out," and you jump out. But in icing conditions, it doesn't do it. That doesn't happen. You're either in the conditions and they last for a long time, or you know that you're going to be penetrating into the conditions, so you have time to plan for it. But it still doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of issues that become extremely important to being able to operate correctly. Now, today, situation Garry and I are in, would I go fly on a day like today? No. We were doing it before because, number one, it was a scheduled airline operation.
You had to.
And
It's
there
your
were
job.
procedures, so you had to. It was your job. You were a professional pilot to do that. But you also had the ground handling people who were there to help you. ATC knew how to do it. Gary's talking about the going faster coming down. They would have more spacing on airplanes coming down because they knew that was going to happen. So everybody in the game participates. As a private pilot, it's you. It's totally on you. And I know with my airplane, I have no de-icing anything on that. And so it's a day like today, you're not going to go. You're not going to fly into these conditions because it's too drastic what can happen to the airplane.
And people don't realize what just a little bit of ice does to this wing. The wing is nice and smooth. All of our wings are very smooth, and they're smooth for a reason. That's because you need the laminar flow of the air across here and underneath the wing so that it generates lift. This is critical. You got to have lift. So if you start putting ice on this airplane, the ice isn't just like the smooth little ice cube you see in your drink. No, it typically comes like sandpaper, like real rough sandpaper, and it disturbs that laminar flow over there, and it just wreaks havoc on an aircraft. And the bad news is nobody in the jet knows that it's doing it. There's nothing in the cockpit that says, hey, by the way, your wing now can only handle 7 units of AOA. When it was clean, it could used to do 12 units. No, none of that's there. It's all gone. And you just have to, because of experience, studying, knowledge, talking to other pilots, all these things to get your handle around the jet that's flying around with ice. And even though you may penetrate the weather and you make it through the weather and you break out, now you have a whole set of new problems because you really don't know what the runway is going to be.
Right.
They may say that the runway is dry or whatever it is, but you really don't know until you touch down. And both of us are flying high-speed tricycles.
Yep.
And man, I'm telling you what, when you come down that runway, things change. And how do I get this thing stopped in the amount of room that I have? How do I get it to turn? Because I remember one time we have what's called a tiller on the side, and it's like a small little steering wheel, and that's what you use to turn the nose wheel to get the aircraft to come around. And I remember turning the nose, moving the tiller moves the nose wheel, and it may turn to left, but the airplane kept going straight.
Going straight. Yeah.
And you have to figure out the speed of which you can physically do this. And oh my God, coming into the gate, oh Lord Almighty, all of this stuff has to come together because you're in charge. It's your jet, you're in charge of it. And it's very, very complicated, and experience is a wonderful thing.
And everything slows down. I mean, the operation,
yes.
everything slows way down. Nobody tries to get anybody to move faster or those kinds of things. And then there's one other kind of icing that I always found interesting, because I wasn't aware of it at first because I didn't fly the 80, Garry did, was that it could be a clear, nice day outside, and you'd walk underneath or near an MD-80, and you'd see ice underneath the wing.
There's a frost all underneath the wing, and it's just amazing. We were allowed to could go with it because it was underneath the wing, not on top of the wing. If you could take your fingernail and you could scrape the ice and feel the metal of the jet. Now that's technology.
Yeah. Well, so the airplane's getting cold soaked.
Cold soaked.
It's up at
because of the tanks.
It's up at altitude, and the skin of the airplane is so close
right
to the fluid,
the tanks,
right to the tanks, that it would get cold soaked. So when it would get down on the ground, I remember seeing it in Houston all the time.
Weird.
When it would be warm and the humidity would be up especially, and you just see these sheets of frost on the bottom of the airplane. One of the things we both looked at before this, and I'm going to run through these really quick. These were some rules that were done. Let's see, what are these? This says this is 1980, but these actually go back to the 40s. And I just thought I'd read through these real quick because a lot of these still apply today. It says maintain your flying speed. Oh, it says if you ever expect to tell your grandchildren about your flying career, remember these 15 rules. Here they
Important.
are. Maintain your flying speed. If freezing temperatures exist, be on the alert to detect ice when flying through clouds. Turn on pitot heat in anticipation of moisture, regardless of outside air temperature. De-ice the propeller in anticipation of ice, and keep the de-icers operating while in icing conditions. If the de-icer fails to clear the propeller, increase your RPM periodically. If you have ice, land under power. Fly the ship on.
Yes.
Yeah. If you are taking impact ice, move the throttle occasionally. We had to do that on. Garry was talking about on the descent. We didn't have to keep power on so much as that every 10 minutes or so we had to run the power up to about 45% and back and forth.
Really?
Yeah. On the 7.3.
Wow.
When moisture is present, keep the carburetor temperature above freezing to prevent icing. If loss in manifold pressure occurs. Clean water, frost, and snow. Clean frost and snow off your airplane before you take off. Always a good idea.
That'd be important.
Hold seaplane taxiing down to minimum under freezing temperatures. When you run into wet, sticky snow, climb above it.
Yeah.
Avoid turbulent areas. Fly above or below clouds if possible. When necessary to fly in icing clouds, seek temperatures under 15 degrees Fahrenheit if possible. If you have to go through an icing region, go through as fast as you can and maintain your flying speed. And those are rules that were written a long time ago.
Back in the 40s.
And they are still good. Let's see. When I came to flying in ice, I was taught fly fast. Heat is cheap. Planes are expensive. So yeah, very good,
are.
Jim. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So
Yeah.
we've pretty much gone overtime here today, but we thought that this would be an interesting subject to discuss for you all today.
And remember, ice ain't nice.
Yeah, ice ain't nice. So for Garry Goff, Jim Hodgson here at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home to the most touchable warbirds in Texas, thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you Saturday.
See ya.
Bye.